Hi everybody, welcome to the lecture on the central and peripheral nervous system. We'll start with the anatomy of the spinal cord. The spinal cord, as we know, is enclosed within the vertebral column. It starts at the foramen magnum, the giant hole in the base of the skull, and extends down to either the L1 or L2, the lumbar vertebrae. The spinal cord terminates or ends in a cone-shaped structure called the conus medullaris. The terminal end of the spinal cord, so the most distal end closest to the behind, occurs near lumbar vertebral levels 1 and 2. After the spinal cord tapers out, the spinal nerves continue down, as you see below, as dangling nerve roots called the cauda equina, which translates into horse's tail because that's what it looks like. The spinal cord, like the brain, is covered by the meninges, the 3 layers of connective tissue. The pia mater, the one that looks like saran wrap directly on the brain tissue, is the part that's directly adhered to the spinal cord and extends all the way down past the filum terminale, past the conus medullaris, down to the sacrum, the S2 vertebra, the second bump on the sacrum, in a structure called the filum terminale, which attaches to the posterior aspect of the coccyx or tailbone. And even though the pia mater is very, very fine and thin, it's stronger than it seems. So it basically keeps the spinal cord from letting go and sort of snapping back up towards the brain. Denticulate ligaments secure the spinal cord laterally to the walls of the vertebral column, so to the foramen in the vertebrae. The meninges extend well beyond where the physical spinal cord ends, and this provides convenient sites for lumbar taps as well as saddle blocks or epidurals. There are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they pass out from the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramen, the holes created by the stacked vertebrae. Spinal nerves emerging from the inferior aspect of the cord travel through the vertebral canal to their destination and then form that cauda equina, or horse's tail, that extends down past the end of the spinal cord itself. Spinal nerves are what we call mixed, meaning they have both a sensory and a motor aspect. Their motor fibers begin on the ventral or anterior part of the spinal cord at the anterior horns, right here. The roots of their sensory fibers are located on the dorsal or posterior side of the spinal cord in the posterior root ganglia. Remember, ganglia are clusters of cell bodies within the central nervous system. When the motor and sensory fibers exit the spinal column through the intervertebral foramina and pass through the meninges, they join together to form the spinal nerves, which you see here. Right? So we have the outgoing motor here on the ventral side, and we have the incoming sensory on the dorsal or posterior side. But think of it like the 2 lanes of a highway. They're mixed in the spinal nerve because we have incoming sensory fibers and outgoing motor fibers running in the same nerve. So if we look at the spinal cord, to me it kind of looks like either a butterfly or a letter H, with the gray matter being in the inside, which is sort of the opposite of how we see it laid out in the brain. The dorsal or posterior horns, if you look, extend all the way to the edge of the white matter. So in these, anytime it's gray matter, those are the cell bodies of neurons because they're not myelinated, so they're gray instead of white. So the dorsal or posterior horns contain the cell bodies upon which the axons coming into the back of the spinal cord, carrying sensory information from the periphery synapse. The ventral or anterior horns, the gray matter that does not extend out towards the edge of the white matter, contain the cell bodies of the motor or outgoing neurons that then innervate skeletal muscles. And think of the acronym SAME-DAVE, sensory afferent, motor efferent, dorsal afferent, ventral efferent. In the center of the spinal cord is an area known as the gray commissure. This central area of gray matter, so neuronal cell bodies, connects the two vertical regions of the horns and surrounds the central canal, which contains cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF. Now let's start on the dorsal side of the spinal cord, right, which is the back, the posterior side, and this is where incoming sensory neurons are going to enter. So we have in the light blue down here, we have incoming sensory neurons. We also have in the mix some interneurons, which are going to be like the relay neurons between the sensory and the outgoing red or efferent. But both are coming into the back, and they're actually going to make a synapse. They're going to signal onto a sensory neuron cell body located in this structure right here called the dorsal root ganglion. Again, remember that a ganglion is a cluster of neuronal cell bodies, gray matter, within the central nervous system. Okay, so there's a synapse there. The ventral root contain the axons of the outgoing motor or efferent neurons, which are leaving the ventral horn. The spinal nerves then are the fusion of the dorsal and ventral roots. The white matter of the spinal cord is white because it's comprised of myelinated axons, sort of the insulation on the wire, if you will. The white matter comprises or consists of the ventral median fissure, which is more open, you see it down here, than is the dorsal median fissure. And then you have the columns. So we have the dorsal or posterior funiculi. Funiculus means bundle of sticks, and here it means that the individual axons of all the neurons look like sticks, so bundles of axons. So we have the dorsal or posterior columns or funiculi, the lateral columns or funiculi, and then the ventral columns or funiculi, all white myelinated axons. Each column or funiculus contains a number of tracts, which remember are groups of neuronal axons inside the central nervous system. And tracts are composed of axons with the same origin, terminus, and function. The ascending, incoming sensory tracts carry impulses to the brain. The descending, outgoing motor tracts carry impulses from the brain to the skeletal muscles. And this diagram is not for you to memorize these, but rather to illustrate the point that the distribution of the various tracts within the spinal cord are not mirror images. So what you're seeing here are the motor and outgoing or the descending efferent pathways in red. And you see those are primarily on the right side because you're facing the spinal cord, right? This is the right side of the spinal cord versus on the left side. We have the incoming sensory or ascending tracts. This slide is just to show you a summary of the function of the various cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 1 is the olfactory nerve. It arises from the olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity and passes through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone in the skull, the one that, if you recall from lab, has all the little pinprick holes in it. Fibers run through the olfactory bulb and terminate in the primary olfactory cortex. It functions solely by carrying incoming or afferent impulses for the sense of smell. So here we see the frontal lobe of the cerebral hemisphere, the gray area. We have the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. Here's the cribriform plate of the skull and all the various filaments of the olfactory nerve or cranial nerve 1. Cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. It arises from the retina of the eye and passes through the optic canals of the skull to converge at what's known as the optic chiasm, which is a crisscrossing or cross of sorts. The optic nerves then continue to the thalamus where they synapse. From there, the optic radiation fibers run to the visual cortex of the brain in the occipital lobe, the posterior-most lobe. The cranial nerve 2, or the optic nerve, functions solely by carrying afferent impulses, so incoming sensory impulses for the sense of vision. So here we see the eyeballs, right? With the back of the eye is all the nervous tissue of the retina, which then merges into the optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, and you see that the optic nerve from the right eye then crosses over at the optic chiasm to synapse in the left hemisphere of the cerebrum and vice versa. Cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. Fibers of the oculomotor nerve extend from the ventral midbrain, pass through the superior orbital fissure in the eye socket, and go to the extrinsic muscles of the eye. The functions of the oculomotor nerve include raising the eyelid, directing the eyeball, constricting the iris, and controlling the shape of the lens. The latter two functions, constricting the iris and controlling the lens shape, are parasympathetically controlled. The parasympathetic cell bodies are located in what's known as the ciliary ganglia. Here you can see the oculomotor nerve coming from the midbrain and innervating here the superior rectus muscle, the inferior rectus muscle, as well as the various lateral and oblique muscles. Cranial nerve 4, the trochlear nerve, emerges from the dorsal midbrain and enters the orbits or eye sockets via the superior orbital fissures, the little kind of cracks above the eye, and they innervate the superior oblique muscle. The trochlear nerve is primarily a motor nerve that directs the eyeball movements. So here you see it innervating the superior oblique muscle. Cranial nerve 5 is known as the trigeminal nerve, and tri means 3, so it's composed of 3 divisions: V1, the ophthalmic division, V2, the maxillary division, and V3, the mandibular division. Fibers run from the face to the pons of the brainstem via the superior orbital fissure in the case of the ophthalmic division, the foramen rotundum in the skull for the V2 or maxillary division, and through the foramen ovale, another skull foramen, for the mandibular or V3 division. The trigeminal nerve conveys sensory or incoming impulses from various areas of the face, the V1 branch, and V2, and supplies the motor fibers, which is the V3 branch, for mastication, aka chewing. Tic douloureux, or trigeminal neuralgia, can cause some of the most excruciating pain known and is caused by inflammation of the trochlear nerve. In extremely severe cases, the nerve has to be cut in order to relieve the agony, but results in loss of sensation on the affected side of the face. So here you can see the trigeminal nerve, right? And we see the ophthalmic division, V1. We have the maxillary division over here. So here's ophthalmic, here's maxillary, and here's mandibular. Cranial nerve 6 is known as the abducens nerve. Fibers of the abducens nerve leave the inferior pons of the brainstem and enter the orbit via the superior orbital fissure. The abducens nerve is primarily a motor nerve innervating the lateral rectus muscle, which abducts the eye, hence the name abducens nerve. Cranial nerve 7 is the facial nerve. Fibers of the facial nerve leave the pons of the brainstem, travel through the internal acoustic meatus near the ear, and emerge through the stylomastoid foramen to the lateral aspect of the face. Motor functions of the facial nerve include controlling facial expression and transmittal of parasympathetic impulses to the lacrimal or tear glands and the salivary glands, including the submandibular and sublingual salivary glands. The sensory function of the facial nerve is controlling taste from the taste buds of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. A lot of people will splay their hand out with the palm near the ear and then the fingers splayed out to show the various branches of the facial nerve. Damage to the facial nerve can result in a condition known as Bell's palsy, which causes paralysis of the facial muscles on the affected side, as well as a loss of taste sensation. It can be caused by herpes simplex 1 virus, as well as a variety of other conditions, including Lyme disease. Results of Bell's palsy include the lower eyelid drooping, the affected corner of the mouth sagging, tears dripping continuously from the eye because it cannot be completely closed, resulting maybe in the long term of dry eye. And then the condition can disappear spontaneously without treatment, but oftentimes does require follow-up treatment. Cranial nerve 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve, and fibers arise from the hearing and equilibrium apparatus of the inner ear, pass through the internal acoustic meatus, and enter the brainstem at the border of the pons and the medulla. There are two divisions, the cochlear division for hearing and the vestibular division for balance or equilibrium. Both functions are solely sensory, equilibrium/balance and hearing. As you can see, and you'll go over more in the beginning part of A&P2, we have two divisions to the vestibulocochlear nerve, one coming from the cochlea, this sort of spiral snail shell shaped structure, which is for hearing, and then we have the semicircular canals up here, which are for equilibrium or balance. So we have the vestibular branch, we have the cochlear branch, which merge to form the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Fibers emerge from the medulla of the brainstem, leave the skull via the jugular foramen, and run to the throat. Cranial nerve 9 is a mixed nerve with both sensory and motor functions. The motor functions include innervating the part of the tongue and pharynx or throat, and providing motor fibers to the parotid salivary gland, which lies just inferior and anterior to the ear. Sensory functions are the fibers that conduct taste and general sensory impulses for swallowing and along the tongue. Cranial nerve 10 is the vagus nerve, and it is the only cranial nerve that extends beyond the head and neck. Fibers from the vagus nerve emerge from the medulla via the jugular foramen. It is also a mixed nerve. Most motor fibers are parasympathetic fibers running to the heart, lungs, and visceral organs. The sensory function is in taste. Paralysis of the vagus nerve leads to hoarseness, and total destruction will cause death. Cranial nerve 11 is the accessory cranial nerve. It is formed from a cranial root emerging from the medulla and a spinal root arising from the superior region of the spinal cord. So we have one part arising from the brainstem and one from the spinal cord itself. The spinal root passes upward into the cranium via the foramen magnum. The accessory nerve then leaves the cranium via the jugular foramen. It is primarily a motor nerve supplying the larynx, pharynx, and soft palate, and it also innervates the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid muscles, which move the head and neck. Finally, we have cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. Fibers of the hypoglossal nerve arrive from the medulla and exit the skull via the hypoglossal canal. The hypoglossal nerve innervates both extrinsic and intrinsic muscles of the tongue, which contribute to both swallowing and speech. If damaged, the hypoglossal nerve leads to difficulties in speech and swallowing and an inability to protrude or stick out the tongue. We mentioned at the beginning of this lecture that spinal nerves are mixed. This again means that they contain myelinated axons of both outgoing efferent motor neurons leaving the ventral root, as well as the incoming afferent sensory nerve fibers entering the dorsal root. Almost immediately upon leaving the spinal cord, spinal nerves divide into what are called dorsal and ventral rami. Singular version is ramus. Okay, so here we have again the gray matter, which in this diagram is more of like an army green. You see that the gray matter, which are all the cell bodies of the neurons, on the ventral or anterior side, they don't come right to the periphery of the white matter, whereas on the dorsal side they do. So we have a mixed spinal nerve down here. We have incoming axons from the afferent or sensory neurons. Oftentimes they will synapse on cell bodies of neurons that are in this dorsal root ganglion, and then the axons, right here's a cell body, then we have the axons that come in the dorsal part of the spinal cord, and then synapse with cell bodies in this dorsal horn. These can either be sensory neurons or interneurons, but then they synapse onto the cell bodies of motor neurons in the ventral or anterior horn, and then those axons come out the ventral or anterior columns here, out the root here, and then back into the mixed spinal nerve. A nerve plexus is a network of intersecting nerves. Except for the ventral or anterior rami of the thoracic number 2, T2 through T11 nerves, nerve plexi combine sets of ventral rami of various spinal nerves that serve the same area of the body into one large grouped nerve. There are several nerve plexi in the body, including the cervical plexus, which serves the head, neck, and shoulders, the brachial plexus, which serves the chest, shoulders, arms, and hands, the lumbar plexus, which serves the back, abdomen, groin, thighs, knees, and calves, the sacral plexus, which serves the pelvis, buttocks, genitals, thighs, calves, and feet, the celiac plexus, which serves the internal organs, the coccygeal plexus, which serves a small region over the coccyx or tailbone, and Auerbach's plexus, which serves the GI or gastrointestinal tract. The cervical plexus is comprised of the ventral rami of the first 4 cervical spinal nerves located from C1 to C4 in the neck. The cervical plexus serves the back of the head, the neck, and the shoulders. The phrenic nerve is formed by fibers from C3, C4, and C5 cranial nerves and lies on the scalenus anterior or anterior scalene muscle. The phrenic nerve enters the thorax or chest by passing between the subclavian artery and vein and pierces the diaphragm to supply it. If the phrenic nerve is severed, a person will suffocate. The brachial plexus is comprised of the anterior or ventral rami of spinal nerves C5 through C8, as well as T1. The nerves of the brachial plexus allow the arm, forearm, and hand to move and feel things. The lumbar and sacral plexi are comprised, the primary ventral rami of the 5 lumbar nerves form the lumbar plexus, and then the first 4 sacral nerves make up the sacral plexus. So we have L1 through L4 and S1 through S4. The anterior branches of the lumbar and sacral plexus supply the flexor muscles of the limb, and the posterior branches supply the extensor and abductor muscles. Finally, we have what's called a reflex arc as they all come together. So we have sensory input coming from the periphery, coming in, synapsing on cell bodies of sensory neurons in the dorsal root ganglion, and then having those sensory axons traveling through the dorsal root to the posterior horn or dorsal horn of the spinal cord. There we have interneurons carrying the signal from those incoming sensory neurons through to the ventral horn, which contain the cell bodies of the outgoing motor or efferent neurons, whose axons then travel out the anterior columns, out through the mixed spinal nerve to effectors, where they can mediate an effect. So this would be a skeletal muscle or sometimes a gland. The smaller dorsal rami serve the skin and musculature of the posterior body trunk. The ventral or anterior rami of spinal nerves T2 through T12 pass anteriorly as the intercostal nerves, the ones that go between the ribs. They serve the intercostal muscles of the ribs, as well as the skin and muscles of the anterior and lateral trunk. The ventral rami of all other spinal nerves form those complex nerve plexuses, which serve the motor and sensory needs of the muscles and skin of the limbs.